not make sense. Herschel Shanks was charmed by this mix of modern technology, ancient literature, and a crusade for intellectual freedom. So he quietly made plans, with financial support from the scholar and philanthropist Manfred Lehmann, to begin publishing the Wacholder-Abegg reconstructions as a preliminary edition of the unpublished Dead Sea Scrolls under the imprimatur of the Biblical Archaeology Society. But simultaneously with that, and I never told Wacholder, I kept Wacholder's confidence, Shanks told me, I get a call from William Cox, not from Eisenman. I almost hung up on him. He says I'm a lawyer from Los Angeles and I have a client and I'm not at liberty to disclose who he is. I said, wait a minute, I don't even want to talk to you if you're from an undisclosed client. If you want to tell me who your client is, well, go on talking, otherwise that's the end of the conversation. That's my way. Let's be open and above board. But the ploy didn't work, Shanks admitted. I did stay on the phone. Cox explained that he was in possession of a complete set of Dead Sea Scroll photographs, which would be made available through Robert Eisenman, though Eisenman was neither his client nor the source. With Brill apparently frightened out of the picture by the international team in Madrid, taking up his project offered yet another way for Shanks to strike back. The negotiations went forward with Cox and eventually with Eisenman and Robinson. Financial support for the publication was provided through one of Eisenman's contacts. But at this point, Shanks took command. I got the boxes and it was I who decided. We worked with my secretary one Saturday night until 11 o'clock sizing. I decided how big they would be. All we got was a box of pictures and their introduction and the index. We had our agreement how they would be listed. They're not listed as editors, prepared with an index by, very deliberate, and the rest is history. In the meantime, on September 4th, 1991, Herschel Shanks and the Biblical Archaeology Society made headlines across the nation with the publication of the first fascicle of the preliminary edition of the unpublished Dead Sea Scrolls. Though the reliability of the computer-assisted transcriptions was still in question, anyone who wanted to send off a check for a mere $25 would purchase a thin volume containing reconstructed text of the K4 copies of the Damascus document and about 20 other unpublished documents, no questions asked. Though some Qumran scholars questioned the ethics of using the work of others without permission, what else can you call it but stealing, a recuperating John Strugnell told the Associated Press. Shanks, Wacholder, and Abegg were hailed as heroes. We've broken the monopoly. Shanks proudly stated to the New York Times. Then came the next great explosion from an unexpected direction. On September 22nd, Dr. William A. Moffett, director of the Huntington Library in San Marino, California, gave an order that made the revolution in Qumran studies just about unstoppable. He instructed that his institution, one of the most respected private research libraries in America, would open its own complete set of Dead Sea Scrolls photographs to all qualified scholars immediately. This was not just a matter of procedure. It was a step that could not easily be taken back. Under the headline, "The monopoly over the Dead Sea Scrolls is ended. Stretching across the three center columns of the front page of the Sunday New York Times on September 22nd was a picture of a white-gloved William Moffat standing next to photographer Robert Schlosser, closely examining an original scroll negative. It will be very hard for the cartel that's controlled the scrolls to put the genie back in the bottle, Moffat said to the Times reporter, gloating. The jig was up for the scroll establishment, or so it certainly seemed at the time. On September 25th, the Israel Antiquities Authority and the international team drafted articles of conditional surrender. In a dense, legal-sized, single-spaced press release, the IAA agreed, in principle, to facilitate free access to the photographs of the scrolls. But the important sentence was buried down near the bottom. While all pictures involved are in favor of free access to the photographs of the Dead Sea Scrolls, it is also felt that the work of the scholars who in recent years have taken it upon themselves to publish texts should not be harmed by any new arrangements. But even this attempt at While all parties involved are in favor of free access to the photographs of the Dead Sea Scrolls, it is also felt that the work of the scholars who in recent years have taken it upon themselves to publish texts should not be harmed by any new arrangements. But even this attempt at circumlocution did not last long. The cause of scroll liberation had some powerful allies. 2 days after the IIA press release, the New York Times resident wordsmith and pontificator, William Safire, roared out with a bazooka blast of an op-ed piece, praising the Huntington and attacking the insular jerks in Jerusalem's antiquities bureaucracy. Safire's voice was, and still is, a voice that is closely listened to in Washington when it comes to the public debate over billions of dollars of aid to Israel, the appointment of defense secretaries, and the direction of American foreign policy. So his opinion on the relatively minor international flap over the Dead Sea Scrolls carried tremendous weight. Speaking again of the objections of the insular jerks in Jerusalem, Safire simply suggested that Prime Minister Shamir should shut them up. A full-scale retreat was soon in progress. On October 27, 1991, Editor-in-Chief Emmanuel Tove announced that all qualified scholars would now be granted free access to the Cave 4 materials, even though that access was meant only for personal research. For Herschel Shanks, this was an opportunity to seize back the initiative. It was very clear by that time, he recalled, that they had dug in. They had been completely intransigent, uncompromising, unwilling to move. Now, he believed, was the time to begin the distribution of the facsimile edition, containing the privately obtained photographs. Any scholar who wanted at least to look at the scrolls would not have to apply anywhere for permission. All that he or she would have to do would be to leaf through the pages of the Biblical Archaeology Society's 2-volume set. And now, with the tide of public opinion running strongly in his favor, Shanks felt that he had little to fear, and on November 19th, he, Eisenman, and Robinson appeared at a press conference in New York City, posing for the cameras, smiling proudly, holding the freshly published volumes in their hands. This should end the controversy for all time, Eisenman told a Reuters correspondent. Now it's time for us to all go back to work interpreting the meaning of the scrolls. Though it might have seemed that the final battle was over, the Dead Sea Scrolls story still had at least one more ironic twist. Professor Professor Elisha Qumran later recalled that he was shocked when he leafed through the publisher's foreword and saw his own transcription of MMT. Herschel Shanks had, in one last act of defiance to the Antiquities Authority and the scholars of the Inner Circle, composed a long and biting publisher's foreword to the facsimile edition, giving vent to the rage that he had felt over the previous 2.5 years, attacking the insistence of the IAA to maintain control of the assignments and thus continue to restrict access. He included a virtual scrapbook of his frustrated efforts to free the scrolls. Among the 22 figures appended to his foreword were the 1989 suggested timetable, now a laughable dead letter, the brush-off note by Eyalia Sussman, his unsuccessful letters to Strugnell, Cross, Millick, and Puek to allow other scholars access to their documents, a supportive editorial from the Washington Post and Sapphire's column, the threatening correspondence received by the Huntington Museum, and to show the extent to which the IAA had acted as a bully. Shanks included Drury's threatening letter to Zdzisław Kapera and a copy of the privately circulated transcription of MMT, and he did not even mention Qumran's name in connection with the text, describing the transcription of MMT simply as the work of Strugnell and a colleague. Here was the problem. Shanks did not, or preferred not to, recognize that MMT was not a text that could be read clearly like a newspaper, but was a highly fragmentary document with almost half of the words missing. Qumran's hypothetical reconstructions, placed between square brackets, were inserted in many of the gaps. Shanks had recognized that there was a potential copyright problem with the English translation of MMT, which had been published by Kapera. So he consciously left that out. But as a lifelong admirer of high scholarship, he never stopped to consider that philological reconstruction could be considered creative writing. I didn't give a thought, he told me. I mean, I knew that you could make a claim about the translation, but here was a transcript, and I just didn't think of the reconstructions. How could the words of an ancient author, presumably reconstructed correctly, be claimed by a modern scholar under his own copyright? Over the years, the rights of the unpublished Qumran documents have been treated like legal tender by the international team members, tradable, bequeathable, and transferable. The monopoly might be broken for the future, but Qumran was now determined to defend at least his hard-won property. Elisha Qumran proved not to be another John Strugnell when it came to fighting back against Herschel Shanks, where Strugnell might have responded haughtily and imperiously. Qumran went on the offensive. He hired attorney Yitzhak Molho, and on January 14, 1992, filed suit in the Jerusalem District Court against Herschel Shanks, Robert Eisenman, James Robinson, and the Biblical Archaeology Society. Court papers filed on behalf of Qumran claimed that his legal copyright on the MMT transcription had been infringed by its unauthorized publication. And at the end of the month, Judge Dalia Dorner issued an injunction against further distribution of the facsimile edition and agreed to adjudicate Qumran's claim for the equivalent of $200,000 in damages. Qumran remained adamant that the unauthorized, uncredited publication of the MMT transcript has caused me and my family a great deal of suffering. It had become a matter of honor, not historical discussion. A major achievement of my career has been stolen from me. During the months of intense legal preparation by both sides for the trial in Jerusalem from January 1992 to the February 1993 court date, Robert Eisenman refused to allow his ideas to be silenced by the threat of legal action, and, as usual, had gone his own way. The goal of his struggle had always been far wider than the abstract ideal of academic freedom. From the beginning of his involvement with Qumran studies, he had attempted to discredit the historical conclusions, as well as the exclusivist methods of the international team. Now, with the K4 collection available to him, he found what he believed to be dramatic confirming evidence for his main historical hypotheses, that Christianity had begun entirely within the context of militant Jewish messianic resistance to the Roman Empire, and that the later images of Jesus Christ that form the center point of Christianity outside Judea were the product of a conscious, politically inspired reworking of Jewish messianic themes to produce an opposite ideological objective, undermining, not furthering, the goal of Judean independence, and the melding, not separation, of Jewish and Hellenistic ways of life. Eisenman's participation with Herschel Shanks in the publication of the facsimile edition in the fall of 1991 offered him a chance to convey his revolutionary ideas to a far wider public. Just before the publication press conference, Shanks had published an 2-page layout in BAR containing 3 long secret plates from the unpublished corpus, with translations and brief commentaries by Eisenman. Although it later became evident, to Shanks' great embarrassment, that 2 of the documents had been previously published by Bellet and Millick, and that the 3rd was about to be published by Puek, Eisenman's interpretation was stolen from no one. He pointed out that these representative examples of Qumran testaments, prayers, and visions expressed a militant resistance to foreign oppressors, and the fervent expectation of a Davidic-style Messiah who would be coming soon to heal the wounded, resurrect the righteous dead, and to bring glad tidings to the poor. That was just the start of additional revelations. Eisenman had been working closely with Weiss and his team at the University of Chicago, and he had identified a number of texts among the unpublished K4 materials that he saw as additional indications that the Christian Messiah was merely the Jewish expectation that had been given a name, a mythologized earthly existence, and stripped of its necessary connection to the Jewish law. In this, Eisenman now went much further than Allegro had ever dreamed of going, at least in his pre-mushroom theories. In Eisenman's thinking, the New Testament accounts of Jesus' life were not merely innocent retellings of Qumran's messianic message. They were a conscious transformation of a highly political, anti-imperial ideology into an essentially apolitical devotional belief. Thus, when he revealed to the world the existence of the Pierce Messiah text in early November 1991, the news media was excited, and some of his fellow scholars were aghast. The text in question was 4Q285, that tiny 6-line fragment, not much bigger than a large commemorative postage stamp. It was long buried among J.T. Millick's holdings and had recently been reassigned to Oxford professor Geza Vermes. Maybe that is why Vermes took such great exception to the Eisenman-Weiss reading of this highly fragmentary passage of messianic expectation. According to Eisenman's press release, The text is of the most far-reaching significance because it shows that whatever group was responsible for these writings was operating in the same scriptural and messianic framework as early Christianity. While most scholars had considered Qumran's Messiah to be the usual triumphant biblical redeemer, Eisenman and Weiss read a crucial line of the text as foretelling that the messianic branch of David would suffer wounds or piercings and would ultimately be put to death. Here, Eisenman believed, was additional proof, as if any was needed, that the original international team had been sitting on explosive material for decades, material that would show that the Passion of the Messiah, most probably by crucifixion, as it was carried out with such brutal regularity by the Roman sons of darkness, was a common expectation, not a historical event. In general, important ancient texts are not announced first in the newspapers, but Eisenman was by this time regarded as a dangerous troublemaker and a slapdash scholar for many of his colleagues. And soon after his initial announcement, Gesaviermes summoned what amounted to a tribunal of 20 Qumran scholars to Oxford to judge Eisenman's claims for this document without, of course, allowing Eisenman to defend himself. Their conclusion was predictable. Eisenman was off his rocker because of the frequent ambiguity of Hebrew words that were written mostly in consonants. The crucial word in line 4, HMYTW, could be translated either he killed him, referring to the Messiah's action, presumably against some sinful figure, or they put to death, referring to the Messiah's own grisly fate. The distinguished invitees to the Oxford seminar, all of them convinced of the distinctiveness of Qumran's messianism, saw no reason to see a suffering Messiah in this scrap of parchment. And although there were arguments that could and would be mustered on both sides of the argument, Herschel Shanks clearly distanced himself from the theories of his erstwhile publishing partner. The BAR report on the Oxford seminar was given the deceptively definitive headline, "The Pierced Messiah Text, an Interpretation Evaporates." There were to be more sensations with the publication of Eisenman and Weiss's book, The Dead Sea Scrolls Uncovered, in November 1992, advertised as the first complete translation and interpretation of 50 key documents withheld for over 35 years. The book was filled with terse, dense commentaries and highly fragmentary Hebrew texts. Here was Eisenman's chance, as he would later express it, to level the playing field. Since he had seen how the international team had long used the right of first publication to establish and maintain an orthodox interpretation, he saw his chance to produce the first published versions of many unknown documents, contextualizing them in his historical framework. Thus the book included a transcription and translation of MMT, now renamed Letter on Works Reckoned as Righteousness, placing it not in the Hasmonean religious squabbles of the 2nd century BCE, as Strugnell and Qumran would have it, but in the political agitation for the purification of a temple from the accommodationist priest and Roman defilement in the 1st century CE, and in discussing a long wisdom text that they called the Children of Salvation and the Mystery of Existence, which John Strugnell had been working on for almost 40 years. They pointed to the variant uses of the word salvation, expressed by the Hebrew word Yesha, or the variant his salvation, Yeshuato. Now, As any of the Jews for Jesus can tell you, the Hebrew name of Jesus is usually rendered as Yeshua. The implication here, implicit and unspoken, was that Jesus was merely an abstract theme that was later given a specific earthly incarnation by Paul and his followers. The last document transcribed and translated in the Dead Sea Scrolls uncovered would have significance only to those readers who were aware of how innocently and uncritically Qumran scholars had always assumed that the Qumran sect loathed the Hasmonean kings. As I have mentioned, the whole history of the sect and the date of the establishment of the communal religious settlement at Qumran was predicted on the faith that the heirs of the Maccabean family were seen by the most pious among the population as degenerate, Hellenized potentates. As the archaeological explorations of Pesach Bar Adan in the Dead Sea region had shown, this area was one of particular importance to the Hasmonean kingdom and was unlikely to be the chosen place for refuge for the anti-Hasmoneanites. Eisenman had, as early as 1983, ridiculed the credulity of the established scholars in just parroting the anti-Hasmonean line. It had become an article of faith, applied even to MMT, and yet in the unpublished corpus was a document that lavished blessings and praise on King Jonathan. Apparently the Hasmonean king, also known as Alexander Jannaeus, which apparently indicated that Eisenman, not the consensus, might be right. But here is one of the places where Eisenman and Weiss got into trouble in April 1992. A feature story by veteran reporter Abraham Rabinovich appeared in the Jerusalem Post, describing the circumstances by which Israeli doctoral student Ada Yardeni had been the first to decipher the cramped cursive handwriting of this document, and Eisenman and Weiss, though referring to the Post article, neglected to mention Yardeni's name. That latter became one of the examples used to show Eisenman and Weiss's bad faith and lack of ethics. But here too, the historical point was lost. Eisenman believed that the Hasmoneans always had a loyal, pious following, and it was only when the Hasmonean line was wiped out in the bloody rise to power of the Roman client King Herod that the nation felt itself to be leaderless. Messianism arose just when you would expect it to. Eisenman stressed to me in one of our conversations, when the Maccabean family was destroyed by the Herodian family, a new principle of leadership emerged. The entire Eisenmanian hypothesis about Messianism, Judaism, and Christianity has, as I have repeatedly said, its bitter, disdainful detractors, and they love to depict Eisenman as a crank and a troublemaker who simply doesn't have the linguistic skill or experience to understand the admittedly difficult Qumran texts. But in their dismissal of his arguments, the burden of proof is always placed upon him. The consensus view of Qumran history and dating is an untouchable, sanctified Mount Rushmore of Hasmonean period wicked priest, man of lies, and teacher of righteousness. In most cases, scholars prefer to scoff rather than take anything that Eisenman has said at all seriously. If he could be wished away, there is no question in my mind that the vast majority of established scholars would sit down and start wishing. Thus, the outraged open letter of the 19 prominent Qumran scholars against the Dead Sea Scrolls uncovered became the writ of accusation against Eisenman and Wise at the December 1992 New York Conference on the Dead Sea Scrolls. There were certainly errors of judgment made in the use of other scholars' transcriptions. But, as Eisenman stated in his defense, there was no way that this new interpretation could be seen as intellectual theft from anyone. The Inquisition in New York City over the supposed instances of plagiarism and errors and imprecisions of interpretation in the Dead Sea Scrolls uncovered, although humiliating, was inconclusive. The book continued to sell widely in America and Europe. The real confrontation was yet to come.